Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on professional boundaries for peer advocates. Really glad that you could come here today. My name is Mary McCarty Arias, and I will be your trainer for the next 2 hours. What I'll do is, before we get started, if you can open up your chat, and the way you do that is you go at least to the top of your slides, hit the chat, and then this way, if people would like to start to write in your names and where you are, that would be a good way to start. So welcome, everybody. Let me just do the commercial for the ATTC. I represent the Addiction Technology and Transfer Center. We are the Northeast and Caribbean office, and we are located, at least we used to be located at Columbia, the medical school, and many of us now obviously are working from home. So good, everybody can hear me. Welcome, everybody. And our catchment area is all of New York, all of New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and we have somebody from Puerto Rico, bienvenida, and the Virgin Islands. I think the good thing about the ATTCs is that there are 10 of them throughout the country, and because these are webinars, we get people from all over the country and actually all over the world. So I'm glad that people are here. So this course is going to be dealing with professional boundaries for peer advocates, as it says there, and if some of you were in the courses in February on addiction counselor ethics, there may be some repetition, but the focus or the target for this particular webinar will be for peer advocates. You don't have to be a peer advocate, by the way, to be here. Everybody is welcome. So many of you have seen this before. We have this disclaimer. And the important part about this is that we are funded by SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but they want to be really clear that this course is more the responsibility of the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology and Transfer Center, and not necessarily does not represent the official views of SAMHSA. M. Chappell is Mike Chappell, who is the director of the Northeast and Caribbean ATTC. And good, welcome. I see people coming in from New Jersey, New York. I'm glad that you are here. So you've seen this if you've been in our courses as well. And we always, it's always important really to look at, do words have power? You bet they do. And so we like to put this as one of the values of the ATTC. And since many of us look at people first, we'll be talking about how to do that, or hopefully modeling that as well. So we really want to make sure that we know, and as it says on the bottom, the ATTC network uses affirming language to promote the promises of recovery by advancing evidence-based and culturally informed practices. So what are we going to do today? What are the goals? The goals of this course, by the way, is to increase knowledge around the importance of adhering to a code of ethics, and where we're going to be reviewing the codes of ethics for peer advocates. Many of you have codes of ethics for those of you who are counselors or social workers, and we'll look at, and you can compare, on your own, what that means. So we'll be talking a lot about ethics. If there's no ethics, there's no work. And ethics are really like muscles. I think they have to be exercised. And actually, for sometimes if people are new in the field, they have to be taught. Also, at the end of the course, we'll do some exercises, and it's always helpful to kind of examine your own stuff and how that is affected by work. All right, so what are the objectives? We'll actually look at the possible job responsibilities of a peer. We'll look at the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct for Peer Advocates. We are using the New York version, so if you are in another state, you may have your own, although I think New York has like a really good I think, reputation for writing ethics. So we'll also talk about healthy boundaries, and we'll look at the term dual relationship. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to write in. So SAMHSA, which, as I said before, is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they have a lot of information, by the way, about peers and peer advocates. So this was the word, and this is word for word, how they defined a peer. So I'm going to read it, and then you could write in if there are things that actually you would like to add. So what's a peer? It's a system of giving and receiving help based on key principles that include shared responsibility and mutual agreement of what is helpful. So that's pretty wordy. So for those of you who are out there who are peers, or those of you who supervise peers, why don't you write in? What do you think about that? What would you add to that? So if you go to your chat, please look at what is a peer. How would you define it? Doesn't have to be a clinical definition. Okay, I don't see any write-ins, but I think the key is you may have very different descriptions, but that is what comes from SAMHSA. So let's go on. So what are the values for peer recovery programs? And it really speaks to, again, and this comes from the information from SAMHSA, and it talks about what's important for peer recovery programs. And obviously they want it to be recovery oriented, however you define recovery, by the way. They want it to be person-centered. They want it to be voluntary. It's relationship focused, and it's trauma informed. In fact, many of the ATTCs are doing, I think, trainings for peers on trauma-informed care. So I think that's important as well. Now, the performance domains include a variety of things. So these are some of the examples. So for those of you who are peers, again, please feel free to write in and in your chat. And these are some of the domains that are listed by SAMHSA. One is advocacy, and that means that you might be teaching your clients how to advocate. You may be advocating for them with other agencies, and there's a variety of things I think that you can do. Here's a question for you. What are some of the things you do to mentor or educate? So if you're a peer, what are some of the things you are doing to mentor or educate people? So again, if you would go to the chat, and if you would write in, what are some of the, so let's say, job responsibilities you have to mentor other people? So if you would just type that in. Okay, thanks again for writing in. Okay, now I see everybody's writing, and thank you very much. Let's see what we have here. So I work in prevention, so one of my jobs is to speak to the youth and help them know the facts about life skills and drugs and alcohol. Thanks, Tyler, for sharing that. Jennifer, participating in Recovery Month activities to raise awareness of peer support and the positive impact on the journey of recovery. Thank you for writing that. Somebody else wrote privately, just staying drug-free. Sharing resources that were beneficial for, again, if people are writing privately, I'm not going to say names. I will share what she wrote. So sharing resources that were beneficial for me during shared experiences. Educating the medical staff and the hospitals that we serve on stigma and using person first language. Great. So there's a whole variety of things that people do. And what's interesting too is that peers have different responsibilities depending on where they're working. So some peers are working in hospitals, some peers are working for agencies or government agencies. So there's a whole variety of things. But one of the gifts I think that peers give is the ability to really share their experience, strength, and hope. And it's interesting to look at. Yeah, Anthony, you wrote, for some reason I cannot see what other people post. I can only chat with the host and presenter. I am seeing only my own chats, no one else's. All right, I'll let Clyde kind of take care of that. Yeah, so it seems like, what happened? WebEx has a new system, and so maybe that's what's happening. But I'll let Clyde kind of work on that one so that it seems like you're not seeing others. Okay, that's helpful to know. So I'll read what people are writing in, and if you write in privately, I will not say your name. Okay, cool. Thanks everybody for letting me know where you are on that one. So performance domains in terms of recovery and wellness supports, and many of you are helping people stay in recovery and also providing people about teaching people about self-care. So I think that's important as well. And then finally, ethical responsibility. And that's what it's like, ethics really is doing the right thing. So that's what we'll be talking about as well, is why I like to talk about ethics a lot. So some of you have seen this before, but this comes from Doug Rosenberry, who is working for the Certified Peer Recovery Specialist actually in New York State. And there's 2 slides on really looking and comparing peer advocates to counselors, and then the next slide is peer advocates to sponsor. So let's just take a look at that. And again, I'll read as you write in. If you write in, I'll read what you say since you can't see that. So here's what we know. So you look on the left and you say, okay, this is for a peer advocate. And what do? They facilitate an ongoing lifestyle reconstruction, which is a lot of fancy terms for helping people get their lives back. As counselors, you facilitate recovery initiation. So the jobs are, in a way, obviously they're very different. A big difference is self-disclosure. So for peers, self-disclosure is used as a tool. And those of you who are counselors or social workers know that in some of your agencies it's discouraged, and that you would only use it when it helps a client. So that is really a difference. If you look also at the power differential, but I will say that as counselors, that there is a power differential. With peers, there's a power inequity, but it's less hierarchical. I will say that if you have a job, regardless of what it is, you usually have more power than the client or the person, but it's not going to appear as such. For peers, sometimes you maintain contact after discharge, so the relationships may go on for longer periods of time. For counselors, there's often a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so that's one of the differences on that. Now, advocates versus sponsors. Let's compare. So obviously peers are working for a service organization, and sponsors, again, voluntary mutual aid. And as 12-step programs, or the variety of 12-step programs that people are used, they're very specific. And so they'll use 12-step tools, whereas on the left-hand side, you could see with peer advocates that it's an adjunct to treatment, and actually it's a very strong adjunct to treatment, but the recovery support may go through a variety of different networks or frameworks and not be specific to a 12-step program. So I know some of the peers that I have met have provided a broad range of supportive services. Most peers I've met used to have these really large books of resources, and they would know like every resource that you would need, whereas with 12-step programs you wouldn't do that as well. All right, so why are we doing ethics? So ethics, as many of you know, are a code of behavior that guides our actions on and off the job. So let's look at what we're going to be doing. Now, as I was reading it, I thought, do they guide your ethics off the job? I think it depends, but they definitely guide your actions on the job. So this is from the New York State Certification Board, and they looked at some of the categories in the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. So I think what you'll find, we'll review them. And again, if you want to make comments, this actually with this chat was like in the old days where you couldn't see each other's, and now you're supposed to be able to see each other's, but obviously people say that they can't. So I'll read what I see. And again, if you write in privately and don't want your name mentioned, I will not do that. So one of the big things, by the way, is actually the first one is pretty black and white. So for a peer advocate, here's what you have to think about is one, unlawful conduct. So no convictions for any misdemeanor or felony, no crimes involving possession, sale, or use of a controlled substance. And, when I read this, I thought it's really kind of the importance of a peer advocate staying in recovery. Because if you're not in recovery, then you may get involved in other kinds of situations. I don't know what other people think about that, but it's really clear that you can't commit a crime that involves possession, sale, or use of a controlled substance. All right. So the second one is sexual misconduct. You may have seen some of these slides before if you were here in February for the addiction counselor ethics, but it's really important. It's the second one that comes up for peer advocates. And actually, I'm going to throw out a question, and you can write in and I'll read what people wrote, but why do you think sexual misconduct may be a challenge for peers? You know that it's still a big challenge for counselors and social workers, ironically enough. It is still one of the most violated policies. But one of the questions is, why do you think it may be a challenge, more of a challenge for peers? So if you would write in, that would be great. Okay, so thanks, Tyler. It seems more unprofessional and that a peer advocate is more like a friend than a counselor or professional. So yeah, it sometimes has that feeling of being, and I wouldn't, maybe not the word unprofessional, but there's different boundaries of it, and that friendly becomes like a friend. And so I think that's where people get into trouble. So thank you for writing that. You're there to support and empower them. And if you cross the line, it takes them back of being used. Professional boundaries feel less defined between peer and client. Yeah, definitely. We can relate closely to our clients and we become friends with them. It's different dynamic. And yeah, I think that's important to realize that it is a different dynamic. On the other hand, it is still important to follow the ethics. Yeah, do no harm. That is important as well. I was thinking too is that for a lot of times, excuse me, counselors often meet clients in a formal setting. So it might be in your agency or in a hospital, whereas peers are often meeting their clients in a park, or in the old days in a restaurant, or in a variety, making home visits. In some of the cities that some of you work in, the peers were making home visits. So it feels a little bit different, and sometimes I think the boundaries can get blurred. But it really is, again, excuse me, no sexual activity with clients, families of clients, or former clients. And the code of ethics doesn't say, oh, you can see a former client in 5 years. It just says, no, you can't see you can't see a client at any time. And actually, Oasis really believes that as well. So I think people also forget that it's families of clients, and it also, by the way, includes online relationships, which sometimes people think, oh, that's not so bad. It does. So sexual activity or any kind of relationships, quote, online, are also against the code of ethics. So one of the questions often to ask is that why is it harmful to the client if you have a sexual relationship with them? Now, if somebody had said, do no harm. So that's a really good way to start. Can you think of other reasons why? I'm going to have it on the next slide, but why do you think it's harmful to the client if a person has a sexual relationship with them? Would you please write in? Thanks, everybody. Oh, now you can see. Oh, thanks. You can see the other responses. Cool. All right. So the question is, why is it harmful to the client if you have a sexual relationship with them? People would please write that in. Thank you, Tyler. It makes them very vulnerable when they already may be in a very fragile state. Absolutely. It's complicated. It takes the focus off their treatment. The clinician or the peer is in a position of power and authority. Yes. Emotional distress. And actually, it does cause emotional distress. They've done some studies that when clients have had relationships with their counselors, that it often results in depression. In some cases, it's been resulted in suicidal ideation. And that is, again, against do no harm. And thanks, Luz Maria, client will not be able to heal to move forward. Absolutely. So let's see what what I have on the next slide. So, as people were kind of alluding to, it breaks down the therapeutic relationship. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And somebody did write in that our population is vulnerable, and it creates role reversal. So it really creates some boundary confusion. And as I said, it increases suicidal risk and depression. So it is very harmful for a client. Now, at the time it's happening, they might not think it's harmful, but remember that it can be, again, very dangerous for the client. Now, what happens is sometimes if a client initiates, and there's probably lots of reasons why they might initiate. And again, the responsibility is on you as the worker, and they may feel, quote, love. You may be the first person who listened to them, or how when you look at being empathetic, when you look at unconditional positive regard, that was one of those counseling 101 terms that we often studied, that can feel like love to the client. And again, you may be the first person who's listened to them. They may feel dependent. They might look at you as a savior. They might even look at you as a parent. So there's a lot of things they can be feeling in maybe their early recovery that may cause them to initiate or to misinterpret what you do when you're listening to somebody. I think the key for peers is that, one, irresponsible, and so it's your responsibility to set limits. What I would say is that it's important that, let's say you go and you do a home visit and somebody comes on to you, I would document any advances and then go back and use the team at a case conference or talk to somebody about it. Whatever I've seen with when people get into trouble with it is they feel an attraction toward a client and they feel embarrassed by them, by their own feelings, and they don't want to share that with anybody. And when people kind of keep secrets, I'm talking about the workers, it really starts to snowball and gets out of control. So yeah, actually, yes, to set healthy boundaries, and we'll talk about that as well. But sometimes if it is, you versus them, it's really important to document any advances so that you don't get into trouble later on. And as I said, if you do feel attracted to someone, talk to your supervisor about it. Or if it's not safe to talk to your supervisor about it, talk to your colleagues about it, but talk about it so that it kind of gets out and you can heal that yourself. I think there's also, for example, when they look at clients having relationships with, let's say, peer advocates or counselors, is there's almost like early versus late warning signs. It also sounds like relapse, right? So what happens is sometimes if you find yourself being extra nice to somebody and you're not nice to all the other clients, but you're giving them special treatment, in a sense, you have to be careful because it can be misinterpreted. I think that one of the trainers from Oasis gave an example, and this is when we were going to our offices, where she had a jar of candy on her desk, and she always made sure that the person she was attracted to got lots of the candy, whereas other people didn't get as much candy. So it just speaks to, again, of, seems harmless at the time, but it really snowballed. All right, so that's the second one. The third one is fraud-related misconduct. So that's a couple of things. One, you can't put initials after your name that are not supposed to be there. I know people have done that a lot, but you can't do that. You don't want to any false claims. You can't tell people that you have a credential that you don't. I don't know about you, about your job, but at my job, when I worked at the ATTC used to be at NDRI, the National Development and Research Institute, and when I was rehired back there, I had to bring a copy of my master's degree because they wanted to make sure that I wasn't lying about it. So I know a lot of people do that with copies of your credentials because I think people have been burned by that. So you can't do that. And you can't sign off on work that didn't happen. All right. So exploitation of clients, what does that include? So in addition, I talked about relationships, but it's also no relationships with clients for financial gain. So that if you're getting money for referrals, although I know somebody used to have a job where his job was to ride around the Bronx and find people who needed treatment, and he dropped them off at a treatment center and he got paid a lot of money. And you can't do that, though. You can't get any kind of money for referrals or products. So you have to be careful. Like if you know somebody who's selling some vitamins or something, you don't want to, you want to stay away from that. So as it says, there are no commissions, rebates, etc. for a client referral. It also speaks to, you can see the picture in the lower right-hand corner, and I'll ask you about this later on about gifts, because sometimes people want to buy you gifts And we'll talk later on about when you can accept and when you cannot. Now, the fifth one deals with professional standards, and you could read it yourself as you go along. But this one, interestingly enough, for the CASAC in New York State, this is really at the beginning. So they have, as number 5, the standards include no discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, sexual orientation, age, religion, national origin, socioeconomic status, political beliefs, psychiatric impairment, or physical disability. So that covers many areas. I am going to throw out a question to you of what stands out for you about this? What stands out for you about this? You notice that's an open-ended question. But yeah, as you look at some of those standards, what stands out for you? It doesn't have to be a clinical response, but it can be just a reaction. Yeah, thanks, Joan. Yeah, no discrimination. And as we know, that is you lately, and we've been doing a lot of courses. My colleague Diana Padilla has done a lot of culture. Actually, Paul Warren's done courses too on cultural competency, but I know that Diana's been doing courses on implicit bias. So treat everyone the same and try to help everyone no matter their circumstances. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, no discrimination for any reason. And this is where I think it's helpful for people to have clinical supervision so that if you have issues with people based on any of those, that you really kind of work them out, and so that you don't take out your own biases or feelings towards other people. Again, sometimes people are not aware of their stuff, and I think that's it's important actually if you're doing any kind of group supervision for peers to be able to talk about that as well. Other people, anything else that stands out? Yeah, I was thinking, I think I took notes from the last time I did this course, and sometimes when people say things like, I don't see color, it makes me nervous. Because if you don't see color, then you're really not seeing the person. And I know what they mean as far as the intention, but it can also be damaging to people as well. Yeah, and as thanks, Luz Maria, one would want anyone, no matter what causes, you would want to receive help if you were in their shoes. Yeah, and actually, the ability to, empathy is one of the core counseling qualities. So in a sense, we say you have to be in their shoes. Maybe you haven't been in their shoes. The advantage I think some of the peers have is they've been in their shoes as far as maybe dealing with substance use issues. And, how do you do that if you haven't? So there's a whole list of things. All right, yes. Is there anything else? I'm going to say if you don't have comments, I think it's good to take some courses on this. And gosh, what's coming to me is I was watching The Bachelor last night, if you watched The Bachelor, and there were lots of issues around race, by the way. And the person who was leading the discussion, his name is Manuel Acho. He used to be a football player, and he's written books on having uncomfortable conversations. So if you're rolling your eyes going, she watches The Bachelor? Yes, I do. But it really spoke to the Bachelor was an African American man, And he happened to choose, after going through like 25 women, a woman who had, he found out, had pictures of her at antebellum parties. And it's one of those, if you had to be there. But I just thought, as they were discussing it, it really brought out a lot of the issues I think that that people deal with. So I'll stop talking about The Bachelor, but let's go to safety and welfare. And here's something to keep in mind too, is that, and one of the reasons I wrote that it's important, is that peers are mandated to report abuse and neglect and comply with mandatory reporting requirements. So if you are a peer, it's important that you find out at your site who are you supposed to report to if you see abuse. And actually, with mandated reporters, it really speaks specifically to child abuse, or abuse of people under the age of 18, and elder abuse. And it's just important, again, to know how to do it. You don't get into trouble, by the way, for reporting, and the you don't get in trouble for reporting, but you would get in trouble for not reporting. Oh, thanks, Yvette. So you watch The Bachelor too, and the bias are sometimes hidden or not known until a situation arises. Absolutely. Seek supervision if this happens. So again, for us, seeking supervision and talking to people, I think is really, really helpful. So going back to this, and so thanks for writing that in. So I'm not the only person who's watching The Bachelor. I don't know what it is about this pandemic, but I've spent a lot of time watching television, and enough about that. So I want to make sure, by the way, that this is an important one about abuse. I remember there was a number for child abuse, and I called it one day because I was training, and I just wanted to make sure that like the number worked, and that they somebody answered the phone, and they were really kind, and they were talking to me about, yes, if you think it's abuse, your job is not to evaluate it, but if it appears to be, bring it to your supervisor and they'll report it, and then Child Welfare Services will go and inspect it and determine whether it's abuse. And you do not get into trouble, or you can't be sued because you made the report. Sometimes people don't like to make the report because it's a friend of theirs or they feel friendly, and that really gets people into some difficult situations. All right, record keeping. What this means is keep accurate records, no falsifying information. So you can't write something that didn't happen. I don't know if people do that so much anymore. When I started in the field and people were writing in things, there was a lot of craziness where sometimes a counselor would go to a client and say something like, would you sign this and I'll fill in your treatment plan later on? But I don't know if that happens. Sometimes supervisors, I used to hear of situations where sometimes actually peers or counselors were asked to do groups, and they were asked to play with the numbers of the people in the group. So I'm going to say that gets you into trouble, so you don't want to do that as well. Another thing is to you don't want to actually, if you're making a referral, you don't want to make referrals to unqualified people or unlicensed people. There used to be a website it used to be called like Quack Watch, and I think the person stopped working on it. But what he would do is he would take almost every kind of thing from vitamins to whatever, and he would give the evidence base and tell you whether it was true or not. So you also really want to stay in your lane on that. So you don't want to make referrals to people who might be, quote, in the quack zone. Other things is that discipline in other jurisdictions. That means that sometimes people will they'll lose their license in one state, then they go to another state, or their accreditation, their certificates, and you can't do that. Yeah, I'm just looking, thanks, Jacinta. The more people talk about biases, race differences, the better the reality people will have with each other. Absolutely. And I think it's really being open to speaking about it. And as Emmanuel Acho said, like sometimes they are uncomfortable conversations, but I'm going to say he did a really great job of monitoring it so that even though the conversations were uncomfortable, people were able to share and nobody got beat up or anything. And it seemed like a helpful thing to look at. So, so going back to discipline in other just other jurisdictions, I think another thing, the 10th one is cooperation with the board. So if there's any kind of investigations that you do have to, you do have to cooperate with any investigations. I see a question and it says, I work as a peer advocate and my employers require me to use my personal computer to input notes. Shouldn't they provide me with a computer from the employer for confidentiality issues? I'm going to say that probably. One of the things, I'll give you an example, like where we work at under the auspices of the New York Psychiatric Institute, it's very strict what we can do with email. Like we have to go through all of these codes to get on our email. And so if you don't have like on your personal computer, like firewalls or things like that, that could be a challenge of who could have access to that. So I would ask, I don't know if you'll get a good answer on that one, or if they expect you to use your computer, then why don't they have some kind of firewalls or some kind of protections for you? And actually, if other people want to write in that, that as well, I think that will help too. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think actually later on, oh, you're welcome. So I think later on, we'll talk about what I've heard people dealing with during the pandemic from some of the supervisors is that people are given a work phone, but they're using their personal cell phone to call people. And I will talk later on about why that might get somebody into trouble. So actually, this is kind of the segue to professional boundaries. Here's a question I will ask because sometimes when you look at boundaries, actually, let me go to the next slide. So and then I'll ask the question. So boundaries are limits you set on what you will accept from another person. They might be guidelines or rules that you create to identify safe ways to behave. And they could be material, physical, mental, or emotional. Like I have a friend who didn't want anybody to touch her desk. She was real clear at work that like if you have to use a pen, don't take it from her desk. She was really clear about that. Some people have different guidelines about what they'll lend to people or what they won't lend to people. Some people have guidelines around physical space. And so here's a question if you're comfortable answering. What are your personal boundaries? Does anybody want to give an example of a personal boundary? I'll give one, like, for example, what I used to do actually prior to the pandemic was when I started to eat dinner, I had a boundary about answering the phone so that I wanted quiet while I was eating. I do have to say that I broke the boundary, I think, because I am living solo. Uh, but I may get back to, again, that was a boundary I had. So anybody else want to share, what are some of the boundaries, personal boundaries that you're comfortable sharing with the group? So I'm going to sit back and let people write in a couple of things. Oh yeah, thanks everybody. So Catherine, I have the same boundary with everyone at the table. I don't like anyone to touch anything on my desk that is personal to me, such as pictures, decorations, etc. Thank you. Right, they don't always like it. People don't always like, sometimes when you set a boundary, people don't always like it. And then that's the challenge of holding on to your boundary. or some boundaries are thicker than others, or like walls. I think sometimes too is people don't like when you set boundaries at first, but sometimes they get used to it. Thanks for writing in. Other people, any boundaries that you have, personal boundaries? Ah, yes, Eunice, please don't disturb me when I'm in a session. Yes, and that's a strong work boundary. Thank you for writing that in. Because, it's tricky if you're in a session and people think that they can come in, it's disturbing on a number of levels. So thank you for writing that in. Other people, either personal boundaries or professional boundaries you have? Oh, so somebody wrote privately, don't try to take something out of my hands. Thank you. Yeah, it really speaks to, again, of space and how close people can get and what they can do. All right. Oh, good. People are writing in a lot of things. I don't like people to just walk into my office without knocking. No work on my Sabbath, which is Sunday. Good boundary. Don't ask me for favors. Don't try to mix business with work. And actually, I think those are examples, actually, of different kinds of boundaries. And you can see that everybody's got a different one. And it's good, again, to know what your boundaries are. Anyone else? Okay. So I'll go on, but you could keep writing in if you would like to. So this is obviously the continuation. While ethics may be a specific code of behavior, some boundaries are based on job expectations, and others may be based on personal values and choices. So some of those things, as people were writing in, and actually at your job, there's obviously going to be very specific things around confidentiality that you can't do, and you have to follow the law on that one. All right, so why do people have boundaries? As you can read, there's a lot of bullets there, but they set parameters. And actually, here's the good news, is they protect actually both you and they protect the client. So healthy boundaries actually would give you, it'll give you confidence. It will also, in a sense, teach a client to have boundaries as well, because they may not have boundaries, or they may have grown up in situations where their boundaries were consistently broken. Yeah, thanks. As people are writing in, boundaries keep the respect in place at work, home, and friends. Thank you. To have consistency, security, and peace of mind. I was thinking actually of, having worked with people who've been sexually abused, is that sometimes some of our clients have had situations where when they were in the bathroom, the parents came in, and it wasn't because they just had one bathroom, it's because they had really poor boundaries about what to do or what not to do. And so a lot of a lot of kind of bad things came as a result of that. So the reason I was telling the story is that many of our clients may have had experiences where they had no boundaries when they were growing up, or in situations where they didn't feel they had control to stop them. But it really, as it says there too, it helps to develop trust. As you, for example, like if you say you're going to do something and you do it, that sets a kind of it starts to develop trust with somebody. It'll also keep you actually on a professional way, and can also help you to clarify roles of what you can do and what you can't do. The boundaries help workers separate home from work. So yeah, and these days, I don't know about you, but sometimes it's tricky if you're working at home. It's sometimes challenging, I think, for those of you who are living with a lot of people to have boundaries around what you're doing at your job, on your computer, and your some of the things that you have to do to take care of children or family members. So boundaries have gotten a little bit, I think, murky this year. But again, I think it's important to kind of really look at them. All right. So here's some questions. Here's what I will ask you, by the way, to write in. So we have a few activities on this one. You do not have to answer these if you don't want to, or you can answer them privately, but let's kind of talk about it. So activity 1, do you believe that you tell the client your own substance use status? Always, sometimes, never. Tells the client your substance use status always, sometimes, never. And give us a reason. So I see a couple of nevers. Sometimes. Anybody want to write why? Somebody wrote in always to be transparent. So always, yes, always giving your experience. Yes, thanks, Catherine. It can be a good connection and a trust point. Yes. Yeah, and that's the key. It's the focus on the client's substance use, not on the therapist. Sometimes depends on the situation and if it will engage the client. Thank you. Sometimes it may be helpful for them to understand that you went through something similar and it may help them in their recovery process. Yes. Do not want to come across comparing. Sometimes depends on my motives for in telling them. What, if anything, does my past drug use have to do with anyone's self-exploration and experience? Recovery is individual. There are support groups to refer a patient to. Yes, that is true. I think the key, and maybe one of the reasons I put this in this particular webinar, is that for many peer advocates, you're allowed to use your recovery. But as people are saying, it's important to focus on them, not on you. Like if you're focusing too much on yourself, then you know that that's you should go somewhere else for that. Okay, I see lots of people writing in. Let's see. Sometimes disclosing could be helpful to move them forward. Yes. Rarely, the focus should remain on the client and not on the counselor. Yeah, and again, it depends, I think, on what your job is. Yeah, and as people are kind of writing, disclosing can be helpful to move them forward. Depends on the role you have in the treatment process. As a peer, it is helpful as a means of mentoring. And yeah, and then that's where I think where it comes into. Yeah, there needs to be a reason for it. Yes. I think the key to keep in mind, and I think, remember at the beginning, we were talking about, like, for counselors, you really do it when it helps the client. And some of your agencies may have guidelines or rules about not disclosing. And again, with peer advocates, it's a different response, by the way. The challenge, and I know, and I've done some trainings for peer advocates, is, when do you disclose? Do you wait on it? Do you wait until you have a relationship with the client? Do you do it at the beginning? And I think those are questions for peer advocates to ask. Sometimes, by the way, is that sometimes you don't have to disclose, but people might look at you and go, oh, they look like me, or maybe they know what I've gone through, or sometimes they'll guess. Like, so sometimes you don't always have to disclose, but sometimes it's important actually as a peer advocate to use that as a tool. Yeah, and again, I think Catherine too is speaks to one of the reasons for disclosing is to help them move forward. And I think some of the challenges with disclosure that you have to be careful about is, war stories. Because if you spend a lot of time talking about war stories, but not looking at how it helped you, then that could be that can be challenging, or not as helpful. So I think it's always helpful, again, say this for peer advocates, is to run things by your supervisors because they'll help you on that one, and then you can use it to help people move forward. I've seen people, or heard of, people have told me stories where they have shared a lot more personal information than substance use status, and I think you have to be careful. Like, for example I'm thinking is that somebody was working with somebody who'd been sexually abused as a child, and the peer advocate had also been sexually abused as a child. And I think you have to be really careful with some of the things that you share and also when you share them. So again, it's really is how does it help the person, not how does it help you. If you find, by the way, if you're a peer and you're telling your story and you're crying about your own story, it probably means that you weren't ready to tell your own story. Right? Want to go on? Let's see what we have for the next one. All right, number 2. Do you believe eats lunch or dinner with a client at a restaurant? I did write this prior to the pandemic, although I think actually now things are going to be coming out where people can go to restaurants. And so do you eat lunch or dinner with the client? And this is often for peers, by the way. Always, sometimes, never. Sometimes, yes. So never. I see sometimes, I see never. As a peer advocate, sometimes I think that's important to look at, by the way. As peer advocates, you are often working, on the street and doing different things. So you could probably do that. I'm reading what people are writing. It can be a comfortable meeting spot, relaxed mutual. I think never for this one because it starts to cross the personal professional boundary. Never for ethical reasons, never. Yeah, it does. It's interesting. So a lot of people are writing never. A few people are writing sometimes. Oh, sometimes, as Luz Maria wrote, sometimes if there's more than 5 clients in a facility, it would be okay. And again, speaking as a peer recovery specialist, I think, again, it's going to be very different depending on your job. So for counselors, you probably would not. For peers, it might be appropriate. Sometimes people get into, I know some of the peer advocates that I met in upstate New York did take clients to restaurants, and it might have been fast food restaurants. I don't know. It was restaurants, I guess, that people liked, but they were given cards, they were given gift cards by their job so that when they paid for the client, it wasn't like they were paying for the client. It was really looking at that the agency was paying for them. So I think sometimes people do their best work over coffee, right? But again, it's going to depend on where you are and actually what you're doing. I'm thinking these days, depending on where you live, some restaurants are just opening up and are not allowing, I don't know what it is, different states have different rules about how many people can go to the restaurant. You always want to go with the safety of the client. That's what I would say. It might be good to eat outside. I know it's still winter in some place, but to look at that. Yeah, if it's in the treatment plan, one of the sometimes rehabilitation counselors used to have sessions where they would take people to restaurants, and the purpose was a couple of things. One is how to act socially in a restaurant. They could also assess reading skills by looking at how people read menus, but it was sometimes to teach people that here's what you do when you go to a restaurant. So it was really some social skills that might be helpful for jobs. And in that case, actually, the agency paid. All right. All right, here's one that people are struggling with during the pandemic. So, do you give clients your personal cell phone number? Always, sometimes, never. Give clients your personal cell phone number? Always, sometimes, never. I see never. Anybody else? I've seen a lot of people, by the way, or heard about from supervisors that people are using their personal cell phone numbers to call clients. Never, you should be given a work phone. Yeah, absolutely. Never keep boundaries, never. Oh, Google number. Thanks, Richard. So as a peer advocate, never. So it's not personal, but it's your Google number. Encourage clients to build a support system, and you are not their support system. Never. Thank you, Anthony. I think one of the challenges, by the way, is if you give people your personal cell phone number, when are they going to use it? I met a peer once who said like she didn't mind if clients called her at 3 in the morning. I don't know about you, but I do not. I tell people actually don't call me after a certain time at night unless it's an emergency. But she said she didn't mind getting calls in the middle of the night. So that's a boundary issue to me. Oh yeah, so thanks. So due to COVID at Bronx Task Force task, you have your Google numbers. Just that people are aware of that because I think I'm saying sometimes if somebody calls you on your personal cell, say you're in the supermarket and you're answering the phone, think about who can hear what you're talking about and how easy it is to break confidentiality. Also, sometimes, when you call somebody on your personal cell and then they have access to your number, and I know you can block that, or some of people have told me they know how to figure that out. But once they do have your personal cell number, you're in trouble. We're not in trouble. That's my thought that you will be maybe receiving calls or you have to set a boundary with somebody. But again, that's a big one that I've heard from some of the supervisors who have said to me in other trainings, can you tell people not to use their own personal phones? All right, let's try another one. All right. Remember before one of the ethical codes really spoke to not taking advantage of clients. So do you believe that you can accept a gift from a client that's less than $20? Always, sometimes, never. Oh yeah, so I'm just reading what that sometimes I would give email to teach them responsibility and to not fear the person on the other end. I know many have never answered phones because they don't want to know what's going on. Okay, cool. Also, with email, by the way, you also want to make sure that you're guaranteeing the confidentiality, and that's why you can use your work email, but not your personal email, because again, that would break confidentiality. So I see lots of nevers. Never should accept gifts. Now, I think for those of you who are saying never, I know that a few of you are counselors. If you're peers, what do you think? Never should accept gifts. All right, I see lots of I see again nevers. I'm going to say that it's for those of you who've written the never, yeah, who've written the never, it's always good. You always kind of err on the side of being ethical. Let's see what other people are writing. I do not accept gifts. Oh, I have a client who brings me a Diet Coke and I pay for it every time. I think that's a cool thing, by the way. Sometimes, I remember once somebody told me a story that they were working in a methadone clinic and the client would be in the waiting room when people did this, and they would read the newspaper, and then when the client finished the newspaper, they would give it to the counselor. So the counselor took the newspaper every day from the client. And it sounds like harmless, right? But you think about it, it creates a different dynamic where I think the client felt like they had to get the newspaper, and you could put in money, you could add up how much that might cost if you were providing the newspaper for somebody 5 days a week. So just be aware of those. So the fact that if they bring you the Diet Coke and you pay it for that, you pay it, that's cool. People are also writing, don't take gifts unless it's done with supervisor's approval. Yeah, and again, if you get a gift and you're confused about it, run it by your supervisor. Yeah, and thanks, Richard, you're a peer advocate and your employer does not allow you to accept gifts. That's probably a good way to, I think, start. I think the key is that sometimes when people bring you a gift, that you have to figure out how to either accept it gracefully or reject it gracefully. And as Vicky writes, you've received flowers or candy, which my supervisor approved. What used to happen sometimes would happen around the holidays. People would bring a box of candy, and then sometimes people would say, I'm going to share this with everybody at the site, and they put it in the waiting room or something so that it's not specifically for them. I think, by the way, if people kept bringing you gifts all the time, sometimes that's a cultural piece. But it be something to deal with in therapy for those of you who are counselors. And so just be aware that sometimes when you give somebody a gift, what does that mean? Think about this too. I remember one of my sisters is a teacher in Chicago was saying that and they might have had a rule about not accepting presents, like even gift cards. Like parents would give gift cards to them, like from Starbucks. And that sounds like really nice, but they had to report it all because there was this idea that if somebody kept giving out like really expensive gift cards to Target or to Starbucks, would that person be getting special treatment? Or would the teacher expect to have to provide special treatment for the person who gave them the gift? And that's, again, my sister is very black and white. She doesn't accept it. She follows the rules, even if she sometimes has to fail people. I am a bit mellower than she is on that one, but she has very strong boundaries, and that's what she does. So the whole thing about gifts, and if the gift is really inappropriate, again, talk to your supervisor. All right. This also might have been pre-COVID. It's always about hugging. And actually, as we go back to work, we'll be dealing with this as well. So hugging a client is a way of greeting. Always, sometimes, never. Always, sometimes, never. What do you think? Sometimes. Never. Oh, well, today, yes, now it's good to give people the elbow high, right? Anybody else? I was thinking, for example, about this whole thing about touching somebody and sometimes we'll say that you need to know what your agency's policy is. You need to know your own comfort level with hugging, and you need to know the client's comfort level if you are going to hug. So many of our clients have been sexually abused. So sometimes when you hug them, it can be re-traumatizing to them. And you know that sometimes some hugs are like too long. So That's why you have to kind of work it out. Let's see what people are writing. Yeah, the elbow high, fist bumps. Yep. As a peer advocate, my employer has directed us to never hug a client. Yeah, and that's probably a good way. It's always safer to do that. I see never. Sometimes it can be okay. Maybe do a side hug. Certain clients, pre-COVID, ask if it's okay. Yeah, and again, sometimes it is a cultural thing and you want to make the client feel comfortable and respect each other. So I'm going to say use your good judgment on that. And as Laura writes in, I used to have a director who said there's never a reason to touch a client ever. Handshake aside. You know, it reminds me of if you've ever worked in a psychiatric hospital, they'll tell you not to touch anybody, including handshakes. So that's why I was saying it's always important to kind of look at what your agency said. Also, if you hug one person, everybody's going to know all the other people are want to get hugs too. So you have to be careful if you only hug some people, but you don't want to hug other people, and let people know. Now, I know that there could be a whole thing around touch and actually the healing power of touch, which many of us know for the past year has been challenging for some of us. But again, from a professional point of view, you always have to be kind of aware of what you're doing. Yeah, the elbow bump. Okay. Yeah, and actually, thanks. Somebody wrote in privately is our clients need to learn appropriate hugs. And so you're teaching them how to, if you go to at a friend who was very like, actually, today he'd probably get in a lot of trouble, but he was friendly with all the women in the office, and he would say things to them that, again, you couldn't get away with today. But he had an intern, and the intern started imitating everything he did. The intern got in trouble. Now, today, everybody get in trouble with that, but just to be aware that teaching people when a hug is appropriate is very important from a work point of view. Yeah, not for a greeting, but there are other occasions that it might be okay. Yes, never. Yeah, it can cause a lot of conflict. So again, probably the guidelines on that are one, I'll just repeat, is know your agency policy. Two, know your own comfort level. Three, what's the client's comfort level? And when in doubt, probably don't do it. All right, so thanks for writing in. Right, as we move right along, we'll just look at kind of the importance of boundaries. And this is stuff that many of you are, I think, aware of. I think the key, by the way, is, especially if you're a new peer advocate and you're dealing with things that you haven't had to deal with in the for the first time, is to realize that really you are responsible. I remember when I was training, sometimes case managers would say in trainings, I don't know what happened. The client kept coming on to me. The client kept coming on to me. And it was hard for them to realize that it was their responsibility to stop that, to really set a boundary around that one. So again, it's like, for example, when you read about a teacher who's having a sexual relationship with a student, like who's 16, 15 or 16, and sometimes people say, well, she was flirting with her, she was flirting with him. And yet again, it's the adult who's in charge who has to set the boundaries. So the professional is responsible. And again, you're going to empower all of you. Even if you are a peer advocate, you're still in a position of power over a client. And again, not as hierarchical, but you still are. So people might do things, they'll follow your lead, and actually modeling is one of those great ways to learn. And that's a gift that many of you who are peers can give to your clients. So you don't want to, again, abuse your power. Again, I think it's really important. So here's some other questions to ask yourself. Some of you have heard us say at NDRI, we used to talk a lot about a belly barometer. Like sometimes you do something and your stomach turns. I always say, listen to your stomach, and it could be any other part of your body that it turns, but sometimes when you start to feel uncomfortable, here's some questions to ask yourself. So am I making this decision because I'm uncomfortable? Am I sure this is best for the client? Sometimes you want to be popular or liked by the client. And is it best for the client? Have I talked to my colleagues or supervisor about this? Am I denying my client an opportunity to grow? So you may feel uncomfortable setting up a boundary, but are we denying that person the opportunity to grow? Am I making this decision because it's the easiest thing to do? And is this something I can negotiate with my client? So there's different kind of questions you can ask yourself. So the famous definitions of transference, and we'll do countertransference. So obviously, many of you know this, that transference are feelings a client has about a counselor or a peer, and it can be triggered by a variety of things, mannerisms, appearance, habits, any internal feelings. And I'm saying that sometimes, by the way, sometimes it works for you, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you remind them of somebody they really liked. On the other hand, you could remind them of somebody who dumped them, who they didn't like. So you may be experienced by the counselor as client resistance. But I think it's just important to realize you can't really control their transference, but just to be able to kind of respect it. What we can control is, or we have help with, and this is good for peers as well, is to look at countertransference. So sometimes the counselor or the peer, we relate to the client as though they were someone else. And when you're starting to do that, you just want to have like this bell go off in your head saying, what's going on for me? It may be based on their appearance, their habits, behaviors, or your internal stuff, what's going on for you. Somebody might look like somebody you knew, or your brother, your sister, your parent, the teacher that you liked. And again, you are an authority figure anyway, but it's influenced by authority figures, early caregivers, or personal history. And again, when you have countertransference, sometimes it really throws people. Sometimes I remember somebody telling me, actually when I was in school, they were teaching us by somebody was dealing with a client and she started crying, the counselor. And so then we started getting into countertransference, and that's why clinical supervision is really important. Okay. Moving right along, a couple of things to keep in mind around dual relationships. Again, I feel like I'm repeating myself from other courses, but I think the important thing is that sometimes when, as it says there, a professional enters into a dual means two, when you have a second role with a client and you're like, it says there, you're their worker and your friend. Some of the examples I've written is sometimes you are a peer and a sponsor, which you can't really do, by the way, or you're a minister and a counselor. So it's two jobs. How do you know people? Counselor and accountant. So look at what you do for your second job. Does it get in the way? If your side gigs, look at what you do on the side. And sometimes people have side jobs or second jobs to make more money. But if you are say for example, you're a hairdresser, you do not want to be doing the hair of your clients. If you sell nutritional products, keep that away from the job. Even like if you're a weight trainer, whatever you do, you just really want to avoid that, because again, it gets things being pretty murky, and it really clouds the relationship. I don't know if people have other examples, but I've seen sometimes, remember when I was training, I think in Buffalo, a counselor told me actually a peer advocate told me a good story where he had about 3 sponsees in NA, Narcotics Anonymous, and then he got a job as a peer advocate, and then he found that his sponsees were on his caseload. So what he did was he told his sponsees that, and he said this gently, is now that I am a peer advocate, I can't sponsor you anymore because it would be a dual relationship, but I'll help you find another sponsor. So it was just a way of, again, separating kind of the job and personal things. They impair the worker's objectivity. It's why if you work in treatment, relatives aren't supposed to be on the same caseload. Or if you had a, cousin of yours who went into treatment, they wouldn't be, actually, they should probably go to a different place. But it really can impair a worker's objectivity. And again, it really can be damaging. It's that whole thing. And the bottom line, I think there you see at the bottom where it says be friendly with your client, but not their friend. So when you're friendly to somebody, it appears like you're their friend, but you're really not their friend. You're their peer advocate or you're their counselor. So it confuses things. And sometimes I'm jumping around on some of these bullets, but it can limit your worker's ability to confront a client. So if you're friendly with them, you might not want to confront them on something that they need to be confronted on. It confuses roles, responsibilities. And again, I always go to agency policy and ethics. It really can be almost illegal. So it's important to keep that in mind. Being a friend, we know that friendships are voluntary and reciprocal. So we don't charge our friends. Like many of you are counselors probably have people who call you up who are friends or relatives, probably. And you don't charge them after the phone call or after the meeting. And with friendships, by the way, it's like one of my best friends is a therapist, and so she listens to me, but I listen to her just as much, and she doesn't send me a bill when she listens to me. So you can be friendly, but not their friend. Starting to kind of wrap up, but just a kind of a quick piece about social media and best practices is a couple of things. Do not Facebook, do not friend, don't have clients who are your friends on Facebook. Sometimes people have professional Facebook pages or your agency does, and that's okay. But if you have your own Facebook account and you put on personal information, do not have clients as friends. It can cause so many big problems. And also, think about, I sometimes think, maybe because as I get older, you think about what pictures you do put on Facebook. One of my nieces always used to put pictures on Facebook of like she was either like drinking or smoking weed or something. And I always say to her, when you get a job or you go for a job interview, people are going to they're going to check those pictures. The ironic part is she studied accounting and she's getting her master's degree and she's already been hired by an accounting firm. So she didn't believe me when I told her about those pictures, but I think it's important. I think it's kind of interesting too, is when you're in the field of substance use, and if you had pictures, and you don't have to be in recovery to be in our field, but if you have pictures of yourself drinking on Facebook, just I think about the kind of the perception. So those are some things to keep. And if somebody asks you if they can be your Facebook friend, you can just say, it's our agency policy not to do that. All right. We've got a couple of, these were just a couple of situations. I think some of these, if you were in the training in February, we did that piece about attending to the children while the client runs an errand. Are there anything, if you want to write in, which of these, there's 4 bullets, which of these would you like to hear how other people are thinking about? So the possibilities are tell the patient agency gossip, borrowing money from a client, buying merchandise from a client, attending to the children while the client runs an errand. Any of those 4 stand out for you that you think you'd like to hear what other people think? Oh yeah, they're all wrong. Somebody wrote in. Actually, yes. Guess that's the answer, right? One of the things too, some of the codes of ethics prohibit gossip. Now, they prohibit gossip if you're gossiping about other agencies you work with. That's the CRCs, the Certified Rehabilitation Counselors. So you have to be careful. I was surprised that you also have to be careful what you're saying in front of people, because when patients know what's going on in the agency, they really shouldn't know a lot of gossip. So you need to be careful with not just telling them, but sharing it out loud when other people can hear. Yeah, no one should be participating in gossip within the agency. Yeah, it's a tricky one too. Um, Sometimes I used to look this up, like what is gossip? What's the difference between gossip and information? But gossip can be very harmful actually to people as well. So thanks, Joan, on that one. Yeah, I'm going to say borrowing money from a client. I don't think, I would always say never on that one. And as somebody wrote in privately, they're all wrong. Buying merchandise from a client, I think you need to be careful of if you're buying Girl Scout cookies or things that are coming from school, because if you buy, let's say, Girl Scout cookies from one client, you're going to have to buy Girl Scout cookies from every client. And it's just, again, it's important. Also, I'll flip it too, by the way, is if you are selling Girl Scout cookies to people you work with, you do not want to you don't want to make your clients buy Girl Scout cookies from you. So I'm picking on Girl Scout cookies, but I was thinking my my supervisor has a daughter who's in Girl Scouts, and actually he didn't make us. He was very clear. He didn't want to make us have to buy Girl Scout cookies. He did put a sign, I think, on his door that said he was selling Girl Scout cookies, and that was okay where we were, but you had a choice, so you weren't coerced into buying anything. And that whole thing about attending to the children, actually, you can get into a lot of trouble for that. But I've worked or I've trained at programs where they're women and children's programs. And so sometimes I remember the HR people telling me, would you tell the counselors not to spend so much time, hugging the kids? Like some of the parents didn't even want the counselors to be hugging their children all morning. So again, go with the agency policy, and like seems like a nice thing to do, but is something. I'm going to say for those of you who are peers, I think it's one of the wonderful gifts that you give to people, to be a peer, so that they have somebody they can talk to. They have somebody who can understand where they're coming from. And I think it's a really important job. And for those of you who are counselors, I think that's an important job as well. So let me go to one of the last slides. Some of you know I have put this in a lot of my my webinars. Guess a picture is worth 1,000 words, so you can look at the word hope. I think it's been a tough year, and maybe as the vaccines or as people are getting vaccines, there's hope. I think the numbers are going down depending on where you are. Some of you are all over different parts of the country, but a lot of you are in New York and New Jersey. So I hope, I'll just throw out hope to all of you to kind of savor that. Are there any questions I can answer? Are there any questions? So the purpose of this, by the way, was to really look at some professional boundaries for peer advocates. And that's why I spent some time going over the codes of ethics for peers, and then looking at boundaries about what they are, and also some potential boundary conflicts that you were allowed to write in. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jacinta. Keep the relationship professional. It's win-win situation. Yes. You can never go wrong, by the way, when you do keep the relationship professional. You can go wrong on the other way if you break down some of the boundaries. And again, I'll say this, which I always say, but whenever you have a question, especially if you're new in the job, talk to somebody. reason something out, find out, where you need to go with this. Because when people keep secrets about some of their boundaries, that's when they get into trouble. And also, it'll be really uncomfortable for your own recovery.